Picture a world where the ground shakes without warning, where waves taller than mountains swallow entire cities, where fire rains from the sky, and no one knows why. For ancient civilizations, natural disasters weren't just terrifying events. They were messages from the gods, punishments for human wrongdoing, or battles between cosmic forces. Think about the sheer awe and fear that must have gripped a Bronze Age farmer watching his fields drown in floodwaters, or a Mayan priest witnessing the sudden darkening of the sun. These weren't just disasters, they were mysteries begging for explanation, and the answers our ancestors crafted reveal as much about their creativity as their fear. From the thunderbolts of Zeus to the raging storms unleashed by the Mesopotamian god Enlil, every culture developed its own stories to make sense of chaos. But here's what's truly fascinating. These myths weren't just wild guesses. They were humanity's first attempts at science, at finding patterns in the unpredictable. When the Nile flooded too early or too late, Egyptian priests recorded it as a sign of divine displeasure, but they also kept meticulous records, laying the groundwork for astronomy and meteorology. When volcanic eruptions buried Pompeii, Romans saw it as Vulcan's anger, yet scholars like Pliny the Elder risked their lives to observe and document the disaster, blending faith with fledgling scientific curiosity. So why does this matter to us today? Because these ancient explanations didn't just vanish with the civilizations that created them. They shaped how we still talk about disasters. Words like tidal wave or acts of God carry echoes of those old beliefs. More than that, they remind us of something profound, the human need to find meaning in chaos, to turn fear into understanding. Over the next minutes, we'll travel across continents and centuries, from the earthquake prophecies of the Aztecs to the wind gods of Polynesia, unraveling how our ancestors wrestled with nature's fury and how their stories, whether myth or early science, still whisper to us today. Ready to decode the past, let's begin. For the ancient Greeks, every tremor beneath their feet wasn't just the earth shifting. It was Poseidon himself, god of the sea, driving his mighty trident into the ground in a fit of divine anger. Imagine standing in a marketplace when the stones beneath you suddenly split apart, watching statues of the gods topple as people screamed in terror. In that moment, it wasn't geology at work, it was a deity making his displeasure known, and the Greeks weren't alone. Half a world away, the Norse told tales of volcanoes erupting because Loki, the trickster god, had been bound in chains beneath the earth, his writhing and struggles setting the mountains ablaze. These stories did more than explain the unexplainable. They turned fear into narrative, chaos into order. But there was another layer to these divine explanations: power. When priests in Mesopotamia declared that Enlil, the storm god, had sent a flood to punish human arrogance, they weren't just offering comfort, they were reinforcing their own authority. After all, if only they could interpret the god's will, then survival depended on obeying them. Kings wielded this idea like a weapon, claiming their rule was divinely ordained, and disasters were proof that the people had strayed from their commands. In Egypt, pharaohs positioned themselves as intermediaries between humanity and the gods, ensuring the Nile's annual floods, a lifeline for their civilization, by maintaining sacred rituals. Fail to honor the gods and the river might not rise, leaving crops to wither. Yet even within these systems, you can glimpse the beginnings of something deeper. Take the Aztecs, who believed earthquakes occurred when the rain god Tlaloc demanded sacrifices. Their priests didn't just wait for disaster. They studied the stars, tracked weather patterns, and kept detailed calendars to predict when the gods might grow restless. It was mythology and observation intertwined, a reminder that even in a world ruled by divine caprice, humans never stopped searching for patterns, for ways to anticipate the unpredictable. That tension between faith and curiosity, between accepting divine will and striving to understand it, shaped civilizations. And in those stories of angry gods and trembling earth, we see the first flickers of a question that still drives us today. How do we find meaning in the forces beyond our control? When disaster struck in the ancient world, it rarely felt random, it felt personal. A failing harvest, a city swallowed by earthquakes, a plague sweeping through homes. These weren't just tragedies, they were verdicts. Imagine standing in the ruins of your village, the air thick with ash, and being told this devastation was your fault. That's the weight of divine retribution, a belief so powerful it shaped entire civilizations. Take the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where fire rained from the sky not because of tectonic shifts or climate patterns, but because the people had strayed too far from moral law. The message was clear: disaster wasn't just something that happened to you, it happened because of you. This idea of punishment wasn't unique to the Bible. Across the globe, the Maya watched their crops wither under relentless sun and blamed themselves. Their rain god, Choctaw, wasn't just a bringer of storms, he was a judge. If the sky stayed empty, it meant the people had grown careless, perhaps they'd skipped a sacrifice or ignored a sacred rite. The solution: more offerings, more blood spilled on temple altars, more desperate attempts to balance the scales of divine favor. This wasn't just religion, it was survival. When the rains returned, it wasn't weather, it was forgiveness. But here's the darker twist: these beliefs weren't just about explaining disasters, they were tools of control. Rulers and priests wielded guilt like a weapon, reinforcing their authority by positioning themselves as the only bridge between humanity and vengeful gods. In Babylon, the Code of Hammurabi didn't just list laws, it framed them as divine commands, with disasters as the price for disobedience. Even natural events became moral lessons. A flood wasn't just water, it was a warning to obey. An eclipse wasn't just shadow, it was a sign of royal misrule. Yet buried in all this fear was a strange kind of hope. If disasters were punishments, then they could be avoided. If suffering had a cause, then humanity had agency. This belief drove rituals, inspired reforms, and even sparked early forms of justice. The ancient Greeks, for example, believed plagues could be lifted by rooting out corruption or exiling the impious. It was a way to make chaos feel manageable, to believe the world wasn't just cruel, it was listening. And in that fragile balance between guilt and redemption, our ancestors found something we still cling to today: the idea that even in the face of catastrophe, there's a way to set things right. While myths and divine explanations dominated ancient thought, some cultures took a radically different approach. They observed, recorded, and analyzed. Long before modern seismographs, the Chinese crafted intricate bronze vessels called earthquake weathercocks as early as 780 BCE. These remarkable devices, shaped like dragons with balls balanced in their mouths, would drop their payloads into the waiting mouths of frogs below at the slightest tremor, not just detecting earthquakes but indicating their direction. Imagine the ingenuity of watching a silent bronze dragon suddenly release its ball, signaling a quake hundreds of miles away before the ground beneath you even shook. This wasn't magic, it was meticulous engineering, proof that even in antiquity, the human mind sought tangible answers to nature's mysteries. Across the continent, Greek thinkers like Aristotle were wrestling with similar questions, but their tools were reason rather than machinery. He proposed that earthquakes resulted from underground winds rushing through caverns, a theory that sounds whimsical today but represented a seismic shift in thought, literally. Instead of blaming Poseidon's trident, Aristotle looked for patterns in nature itself, suggesting that disasters followed observable rules rather than divine whims. His contemporary, Thales of Miletus, went further, theorizing that the earth floated on water and that disturbances in this hidden ocean caused the land to shake. These ideas might seem quaint now, but they marked a crucial turning point, the moment when humanity began to see disasters not as punishments, but as puzzles waiting to be solved. What's astonishing is how often these early scientists got startlingly close to the truth. Roman architect Vitruvius noted that the best building foundations rested on solid rock, not loose soil, after observing how structures fared in tremors. In India, ancient texts described rivers changing course during quakes, recognizing the link between seismic activity and landscape transformation. And let's not forget the Maya, who tracked hurricane seasons with such precision that their calendar predictions still align with modern meteorological data centuries later. These weren't just lucky guesses, they were the fruits of patient observation, the slow accumulation of knowledge passed down through generations. Yet even these pioneers couldn't fully escape their cultural frameworks. Aristotle's underground winds echoed the Greek belief in pneumatic forces animating the world, while Chinese seismoscopes still bore dragon motifs, blending science with symbolism. That duality reveals something profound about human curiosity. We've always tried to understand the world on our own terms, whether through gods or gauges. And though their methods seem primitive now, these early investigators laid the foundations for everything we know today. When you check a weather app or feel reassured by earthquake-resistant architecture, you're benefiting from discoveries that began with ancient minds daring to ask, what if the answers aren't in the heavens but here in the earth beneath our feet? The island of Thera exploded with a force unlike anything the ancient Mediterranean had ever witnessed. Around 1600 BCE, this volcanic cataclysm didn't just reshape landscapes, it rewrote history. Picture towering columns of ash darkening the sky for weeks, tsunamis racing across the Aegean, and entire Minoan settlements along Crete's coast vanishing beneath waves. But the most fascinating part isn't the devastation itself. It's how this real-life apocalypse morphed into one of humanity's most enduring legends, Atlantis. Plato's tale of a wealthy, advanced island sinking beneath the sea as punishment for its arrogance mirrors the fate of Thera with eerie precision. The Minoans, with their sprawling palaces and vibrant frescoes, were the technological marvels of their time until nature erased them in days. Could their downfall have inspired Atlantis? Scholars point to striking clues. Plato describes circular cities with concentric rings, echoing Thera's volcanic caldera. He writes of a civilization swallowed by the sea, much like Akrotiri, the Minoan town preserved under layers of ash like a Bronze Age Pompeii. Even the timing fits. Plato's account places Atlantis's demise 9,000 years before his time, but some argue this was a mistranslation or exaggeration, compressing a catastrophe still whispered about centuries later. What makes this connection so compelling isn't just the geographical overlap, it's how disaster became morality. The Minoans weren't just victims of geology, their fate was reinterpreted as divine justice. Egyptian priests who traded with the Minoans may have passed down tales of their sudden collapse, reframing it as a warning about hubris. By Plato's era, the story had shed its specifics, becoming a parable about the fragility of power. Thera's eruption didn't just bury cities, it buried truths, leaving room for myth to grow. Yet the real lesson here isn't about Atlantis's location, it's about how cultures process trauma. When the Minoan world vanished, survivors grappled with the unthinkable. Was this the gods' wrath, a cosmic reset? Their confusion echoes in every civilization that's faced inexplicable ruin from Pompeii to Pompeii. Thera's legacy reminds us that behind every legend lies a kernel of truth, not just about what happened, but about how humans turn chaos into meaning, one story at a time. The story of a great flood washing away the old world appears in cultures separated by oceans and millennia, not as variations of a single tale, but as distinct narratives with haunting similarities. A Mesopotamian merchant chiseling the Epic of Gilgamesh onto clay tablets described waters so violent they tore the heavens apart, while a Mayan scribe in the Popol Vuh wrote of a deluge sent by the gods to destroy the wooden people who had forgotten to worship. In ancient China, the legend of Gan and Yu told of a hero taming floods for decades, channeling rivers with the help of a magic soil. What's striking isn't just the shared theme of catastrophic water, but the recurring details: a chosen survivor, a vessel of salvation, and the promise of renewal. Geologists have long wondered if these stories preserve the memory of real disasters. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis suggests that around 7,600 years ago, rising Mediterranean waters breached a natural dam, flooding a fertile basin with such force that it may have displaced entire communities overnight. Imagine generations of farmers watching their ancestral lands vanish beneath the waves, carrying not just homes but histories into the depths. That trauma would ripple through oral traditions for centuries, morphing into warnings of divine judgment. Even older evidence comes from the Persian Gulf, where underwater archaeology reveals river channels buried beneath the sea, potential inspiration for Sumerian flood myths like the one echoed in Gilgamesh. Yet these myths weren't just about destruction. The Babylonian Atrahasis tablet describes the flood as a reset button, gods weary of humanity's noise, but ultimately remorseful, granting survivors a second chance. Noah's covenant with Yahweh came with a rainbow. Deucalion in Greek myth repopulated the earth by throwing stones that became people. Beneath the wrath, there's always redemption. This duality reveals how ancient minds processed disaster. Yes, the gods were punishing, but they were also teaching. A flood wasn't just an end, it was a lesson etched into the collective memory, a reminder that survival demanded both humility and adaptability. What's most poignant is how these stories bridge myth and reality. When the Haida people of the Pacific Northwest recount how Raven guided survivors to safety in a giant canoe, they're not just describing a flood, they're encoding survival strategies for future tsunamis. When Aboriginal Australians sing of the Dreamtime serpent causing deluges, they're mapping flood-prone landscapes through songlines. These narratives served as ancient emergency manuals, wrapped in spiritual symbolism but grounded in lived experience. Today, scientists scan sediment layers for traces of these cataclysms, but the myths themselves are layers too, sediments of memory, where geology and theology flow together. Volcanoes didn't just erupt, they spoke. To the Romans, the fiery breath of Mount Vesuvius wasn't mere geology. It was Vulcan, the god of fire, hammering at his forge beneath the earth, his anger shaking the very ground. When the mountain finally unleashed its fury in 79 CE, burying Pompeii in ash, survivors didn't see bad luck, they saw divine retribution. Temples to Vulcan had stood in the shadow of Vesuvius for centuries, a warning that this wasn't just a mountain but a threshold to the underworld where gods and monsters dwelled. And across the globe, the Hawaiians told a strikingly similar story. Their goddess Pele didn't just cause eruptions, she was the eruption, her body the lava that carved new land, her temper as unpredictable as the flows themselves. What's fascinating isn't just the parallels between these myths, but how they shaped human behavior. In Hawaii, entire villages avoided settling near Pele's domain, not just out of fear but respect. The land around active volcanoes was kapu, forbidden a spiritual no-go zone that doubled as a survival strategy. Archaeologists have found abandoned settlements just beyond the reach of historic lava flows, evidence that these stories weren't just folklore, they were lifelines. The Romans, too, built their cities at a cautious distance from Vesuvius after earlier eruptions, only forgetting the danger as generations passed. Both cultures, separated by an ocean, arrived at the same conclusion: some places belong to the gods, not to mortals. But these beliefs weren't just about avoidance, they were about awe. In Japan, Mount Fuji's eruptions were seen as the work of the fire goddess Konohana Sakuya Haim, whose name means blossoming tree princess. Far from a destroyer, she symbolized renewal, her eruptions fertilizing the soil for cherry blossoms to bloom. This duality, volcanoes as both killers and creators, runs through nearly every culture. The Aztecs depicted Popocatépetl as a warrior eternally mourning his lost love, his fiery tears shaping the land. Icelandic sagas told of trolls trapped in lava, their struggles causing earthquakes. Each myth, in its own way, grappled with the same truth, that destruction and creation were two sides of the same coin. Perhaps the most powerful legacy of these stories is how they turned terror into reverence. When Kilauea erupts today, some Hawaiians still leave offerings for Pele, not to stop the lava, but to acknowledge its power. Modern scientists might map magma chambers, but ancient cultures mapped meaning, finding in the volcanoes roar a language older than words. That's the enduring magic of these myths. They didn't just explain nature's violence, they made it sacred, transforming fire and ash into something to be honored, not just feared. In Japan, when the ground trembled violently without warning, people didn't just brace for impact, they imagined a colossal catfish, Namezu, writhing beneath the Earth's surface. According to legend, this monstrous creature was usually restrained by the thunder god Kashima, who pinned it down with a mighty stone. But when Kashima's attention wavered, Namezu would thrash, sending shockwaves rippling through the land. This wasn't just a whimsical tale, it was a way to make sense of the unimaginable. A farmer feeling the earth lurch beneath his feet could picture the struggle below, turning raw terror into something almost tangible, a story that gave chaos a face and a reason. The Aztecs, meanwhile, saw earthquakes through an entirely different lens, not as the thrashing of a beast, but as the aftershocks of divine warfare. Their mythology described a universe in constant tension, where gods battled for supremacy, and every tremor was a ripple from their cosmic clashes. If the earth split open, it wasn't random, it was proof that the gods were wrestling over the fate of humanity itself. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were frameworks for understanding a world where stability was fragile and disaster lurked just beneath the surface. What's remarkable about these myths is how they didn't just explain, they instructed. In Japan, the Namezu legend carried a moral lesson. Disorder was unnatural, a temporary lapse in the divine order that required balance to restore. This idea reinforced cultural values like harmony and collective responsibility. If an earthquake struck, it wasn't just Kashima's fault. It was a reminder that society, too, had to remain vigilant against chaos. The Aztecs took it further, interpreting quakes as calls to action. When the gods fought, it was up to humans to intervene, through rituals, sacrifices, or sheer obedience, to tip the scales back toward stability. But beneath the symbolism, these stories reveal something deeper, a universal human need to personify the forces that shape our lives. Whether it's a catfish or a clash of deities, giving disaster a form makes it feel less random, less indifferent. Even today, when we personify storms with names or describe earthquakes as angry, we're tapping into that same ancient impulse. The names and faces may change, but the purpose remains, to transform the unthinkable into something we can, if not control, at least comprehend. When the skies turned to bronze and the earth cracked like old pottery, ancient civilizations didn't just pray for rain, they bargained with it. For the Aztecs, prolonged drought wasn't merely a weather pattern. It was a cosmic ledger out of balance, a debt that could only be settled in blood. Their priests climbed the steps of the Templo Maya under a pitiless sun, holding the still beating hearts of sacrificial victims aloft like desperate offerings to a creditor. The logic was chillingly precise. If water was life, then life must be given to bring water. Archaeological evidence from Tenochtitlan reveals mass burials of children during drought periods, their bones showing signs of malnutrition, a haunting testament to the lengths societies would go when faced with nature's silence. High in the Andes, the Inca confronted drought with equally drastic measures, but their rituals took on a different shape. They offered Q-Hapak perfect, unblemished children to mountain deities like Ampoto, where frozen mummies like the famous Juanita have been found centuries later, preserved in ice with ceremonial blankets still clinging to their small frames. These children weren't killed in terror but celebrated as messengers, chosen to carry pleas for rain directly to the gods. Forensic studies show some were given chicha beer and coca leaves to ease their passing, a grim tenderness woven into the sacrifice. What makes these acts so revealing isn't just their brutality, it's their meticulousness. These weren't panicked mobs but calculated acts of statecraft, where every detail, from the victim's age to the placement of the body, carried symbolic weight. Yet beneath the surface of these rituals lies an even darker truth, the weaponization of climate anxiety. Rulers didn't just respond to drought, they orchestrated its narrative, framing it as divine retribution for societal sins that only they could interpret. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma could summon rain by sacrificing prisoners from recent wars, reinforcing his political power while solving the crisis. In Mesopotamia, kings would publicly don sackcloth and ashes during droughts, performing humility to show they'd taken the gods' displeasure seriously, while quietly blaming the suffering on the people's moral failings. Drought became theater, a stage where authority was both challenged and reaffirmed through spectacle. But to dismiss these practices as mere superstition misses their heartbreaking logic. In a world without irrigation science or cloud seeding, sacrifice was a form of control, the only lever our ancestors believed they could pull to change their fate. Modern climate scientists might analyze soil cores and atmospheric data, but ancient priests studied the internal organs of sacrificed animals for omens, seeking patterns in the chaos. Both were attempts to predict the unpredictable, to impose order on a world that defied it. The real tragedy isn't that they were wrong, it's that they cared so deeply, that they tried so hard with the only tools they had. When we today debate rising temperatures and vanishing lakes, we're still wrestling with that same primal question: how much must we give up to keep the world from burning? A streak of fire splitting the night sky wasn't just a celestial event to the Babylonians, it was a telegram from the gods, written in flames. These ancient stargazers, who meticulously tracked Venus and Jupiter, saw comets not as predictable phenomena but as divine interruptions, ruptures in the orderly fabric of the heavens. When a comet appeared, it wasn't just noticed, it was decoded. Clay tablets from 700 BC describe long-haired stars as omens foretelling everything from royal deaths to collapsed empires, with priests scrambling to interpret their angle, color, and duration. Imagine the weight of that responsibility. One misread celestial sign, and you might accidentally predict the wrong king's downfall. This dread wasn't confined to Mesopotamia. In 74 CE, the Roman historian Josephus described a comet shaped like a sword hovering over Jerusalem before its destruction, a detail that would echo through medieval chronicles like a warning. But the most famous case came in 1066, when Halley's Comet blazed across Europe just as William the Conqueror set sail for England. The Bayeux Tapestry immortalized the moment, stitching the comet right beside Harold Roman II terrified courtiers, their fingers pointing skyward as if to say, "See." Even the heavens sighed with William. What's fascinating isn't just the superstition, it's the political genius behind it. William's propagandists weaponized the comet, turning a random cosmic event into divine endorsement for invasion. Yet amid the fear, comets also spurred humanity's first steps toward real astronomy. Chinese records from 240 BC detail the orbital path of what we now call Halley's Comet with startling accuracy, while Mayan astronomers in the Americas charted celestial events with precision that rivaled their European counterparts. Even Tycho Brahe, the Danish nobleman who revolutionized star mapping in the 16th century, began his obsession by tracking a comet, proof that terror and curiosity could coexist. The very phenomena that sent kings hiding in their cellars also pushed stargazers to sharpen their quills and measure the night. What's haunting is how these ancient anxieties still flicker today. When COVID-19 spread in 2020, social media lit up with claims that Comet Atlas, visible that spring, was a portent of doom, a reminder that even in our age of science, the line between wonder and warning remains thin. Comets didn't just scare our ancestors, they taught us to look up, to question, and ultimately, to understand that the universe speaks in more than just threats. Long before seismographs could detect the faintest tremors, ancient cultures had their own early warning systems: fur, feathers, and scales. In 373 BC, Greek historians documented rats, snakes, and centipedes fleeing He-like days before an earthquake swallowed the city whole. Meanwhile, Chinese court records from the Han Dynasty tell of restless dogs and panicked horses behaving oddly in the weeks leading up to catastrophic quakes. These weren't just random anecdotes, they were careful observations logged with the same precision as celestial events or trade agreements. Imagine a scribe in Chang'an watching fish leap unnaturally from a canal or birds abandoning their nests mid-season. These weren't curiosities to him. They were clues. Modern science has since uncovered startling truths behind these ancient reports. Take the case of toads in L'Aquila, Italy, in 2009. Days before a devastating quake struck, an entire colony vanished from their breeding pond. Researchers later theorized that charged particles released by shifting rocks had altered groundwater chemistry, driving the amphibians to flee. Similar behavior has been documented in elephants during tsunamis. Their ability to detect infrasound, frequencies too low for human ears, may allow them to sense distant disasters minutes before waves hit. Even domestic animals show uncanny foresight. After the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, survivors reported dogs refusing to go outside and cats hiding in treetops hours before the water surged inland. Yet what's most fascinating isn't just the accuracy of these animal instincts, it's how differently cultures interpreted them. The Chinese saw creature behavior as part of a vast, interconnected system where heaven, earth, and life were threads in the same tapestry. Their word for earthquake, Dijun, literally means earth movement, but their records framed animal agitation as the land itself sending signals through living conduits. Compare that to Pliny the Elder's account of birds avoiding Vesuvius before its eruption. He described it not as mystical insight, but as nature's own logic, creatures attuned to subtle changes humans ignored. Today, biologists and seismologists collaborate on projects straight out of ancient scrolls. In Japan, researchers track eels' electrical activity in aquariums, hoping their sensitivity to electromagnetic shifts might improve quake prediction. In California, a citizen science project enlists backyard chicken keepers to log unusual poultry behavior as potential seismic clues. These experiments would have made perfect sense to a Ming Dynasty scholar or a Roman naturalist, proof that humanity's oldest disaster detectors weren't myths but misunderstood science. When the next big one strikes, we may find that the most advanced warning system isn't a machine, but the collective twitch of a million nervous whiskers and wings, a language of survival written long before humans learned to read it. For the farmers of ancient Egypt, watching the Nile rise wasn't just about counting days, it was about reading divine handwriting. Every summer, as the river swelled with rains from distant highlands, the entire civilization held its breath. Too little water and the fields would parch, too much and villages vanished beneath the flood. But just the right amount, that was Hapi's blessing, the god of the Nile's annual gift of black, fertile silt that turned the desert fringe into the breadbasket of the ancient world. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Egypt's entire calendar revolved around the flood, with seasons named inundation, emergence, and harvest. Miss the signs, and you missed survival itself. This delicate balance between abundance and disaster birthed one of history's earliest forecasting systems, the Nilometer. Picture a stone staircase descending into the river, its steps etched with precise markings, or a column in a temple courtyard, its surface scored with hieroglyphs indicating famine, plenty, or ruin. Priests didn't just measure the water, they communed with it, interpreting its rise as Hapi's mood. When the level hit 16 cubits on the Nilometer at Elephantine Island, celebrations erupted. 18 cubits, prayers turned to panic. These weren't just tools, they were sacred interfaces between humanity and the divine, where data and devotion flowed together like the Nile's twin currents. Yet hidden beneath the ritual was razor-sharp pragmatism. Surviving records from the Ptolemaic period show priests correlating Nilometer readings with tax adjustments. If the flood was low, grain levies were reduced to prevent starvation. Temples doubled as data centers, their walls inscribed with centuries of flood heights, creating what may be the world's first hydrological database. And here's the genius: by framing these measurements as religious acts, the priests ensured compliance. No farmer would dare falsify an offering or ignore a watermark when the gods themselves were watching. What's striking is how this system mirrored the Nile's own duality. Just as the river brought both life and destruction, the Egyptian response blended faith and calculus. They didn't see science and religion as opposites, they were two banks of the same river, each shaping the other. Modern engineers might calculate flood probabilities with satellite images, but their goal echoes the ancients: to listen to nature's whispers before they become screams. When drought grips Egypt today, you can still find farmers whispering Hapi's name, a testament to the enduring power of those old beliefs, not as superstition, but as a language for the unspeakable forces that govern our lives. When the ash cloud from Vesuvius blotted out the sun over Pompeii in 79 CE, it wasn't just a city that was buried, it was an entire world cracking apart. Romans, waking to tremors that August morning, faced two terrifying possibilities. Either the gods had abandoned them, or there were no gods steering the disaster at all. Pliny the Younger, watching from across the bay, documented the eruption with clinical precision. The black and dreadful cloud streaked with lightning, the pumice stones as large as bricks raining down. His letters read like field notes, not prayers. Yet even as he measured the chaos, others were already spinning it into moral allegory. The poet Martial claimed Pompeii's fate was divine retribution for its sinful shores, while early Christians saw it as proof of pagan Rome's impending doom. The debate tore at Rome's intellectual fabric. Stoic philosophers argued that disasters were natural, indifferent events no more personal than a falling rock. Yet the public clung to older instincts. After all, Pompeii's ruins seemed tailor-made for moralizing. Erotic frescoes preserved in ash, bars still stocked with wine, a brothel stone beds frozen in time. It was too tempting not to see punishment. Even Emperor Titus, who organized relief efforts, waffled between compassion and cosmic justice, calling the eruption both a public calamity and a warning from Jupiter. This cognitive dissonance wasn't unique to Rome. When Lisbon was leveled by an earthquake in 1755, Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire seized on it to challenge religious dogma, while priests preached sermons about the city's sins. The pattern repeats through history. Disaster strikes, and humanity splits into two camps, those seeking reasons and those accepting randomness. What makes Pompeii particularly haunting is how it crystallizes this divide in tangible detail. Archaeologists found a child's cradle carbonized by pyroclastic flow. No mythology could soften that horror. Yet in the same ruins, they uncovered amulets to Vulcan, hastily grabbed as families fled, as if clutching at divine mercy. The real story isn't whether Vesuvius was angry or indifferent. It's how humans desperately toggle between both explanations, even in the same breath. Modern parallels abound. When Hurricane Katrina drowned New Orleans, some called it nature's fury. Others saw judgment for the city's decadence. Today, as climate disasters escalate, we're still wrestling with Pliny's dilemma. Do we change our behavior to appease unseen forces, or study the wind patterns and build stronger levees? Pompeii's ashes hold no answer, only a mirror. The waves came at night, swallowing he-like whole. One moment, the bustling Greek city stood proud near the Corinthian Gulf, its streets alive with merchants and sailors. The next, it was gone, vanished beneath the churning sea without a trace. Survivors would later claim they'd seen the bronze statue of Poseidon, the city's patron god, stretch out his hand as if to push the waters inland. The message was clear. This wasn't just misfortune, it was punishment. According to ancient historians, Helice had angered Poseidon by refusing to lend its sacred statue to a group of wandering Ionians, or worse, by disrespecting his sanctuary. The sea god's retribution was swift and absolute, but scroll forward 2,400 years, and a different story emerges from the silt. In the 1980s, archaeologists probing the coastal mudflats near the modern village of Rizamilos uncovered the remnants of ancient walls not beneath the sea, but buried inland, twisted and shattered as if by tremendous force. Soil samples revealed layers of marine sediment mixed with rubble, the telltale signs of a tsunami. Here was the truth: Helice hadn't been punished by Poseidon. It had been obliterated by a massive earthquake, its ground liquefying beneath it before a wall of water finished the job. The same tectonic fury that would later devastate Lisbon and Krakatoa had claimed this city long before those names entered history. Yet the myth of divine wrath outlived the facts for centuries. Why? Because Helice's destruction became a cautionary tale wielded by priests and politicians alike. Athenian orators pointed to it as proof that even powerful cities could fall if they defied the gods. Spartan generals used it to justify their own piety, as if their military victories depended on avoiding Poseidon's displeasure. The story seeped into philosophy too. Plato allegedly referenced Helice when describing Atlantis, weaving the real disaster into a parable about hubris. This wasn't just folklore, it was soft power, a way to enforce social order by framing natural events as moral audits. What's haunting is how little separates ancient Helice from modern disaster narratives. When Hurricane Katrina submerged New Orleans, some televangelists called it God's judgment for the city's decadence. When COVID-19 emerged, conspiracy theorists blamed it on divine retribution or geopolitical sin. The instinct to moralize catastrophe runs deep, a reflex as old as civilization itself. But Helik's ruins offer a silent rebuttal. The earth shakes, the seas rise, and the gods, if they're watching, remain stubbornly silent. The only lesson written in those shattered walls is one we're still learning: that nature's violence needs no reason, and survival depends not on appeasing deities, but on understanding the ground beneath our feet. High above the Yucatan Peninsula, Mayan astronomers charted the heavens with a precision that would leave modern scientists speechless. Their observatories weren't just temples, they were celestial calculators, their staircases and doorways aligned to catch the first gleam of Venus rising or the precise angle of the solstice sun. But this wasn't stargazing for its own sake. When a Mayan scribe etched the movements of the Pleiades onto bark paper, he wasn't just recording beauty, he was tracking survival. That cluster's position in the spring sky predicted the arrival of rains, and missing its signal could mean failed crops, famine, collapse. Archaeologists have uncovered the evidence in places like Dresden Codex, where tables of planetary motions sit side by side with records of droughts and floods. The connection was explicit. Certain constellations didn't just precede dry seasons, they caused them, their movements tugging at the gods who controlled the weather. Choc, the rain deity with his curling serpent nose, wasn't just appeased by prayer, he was influenced by cosmic schedules. If Venus lingered too long in one house of the sky, priests knew to double their offerings. If Mars danced too close to the moon, it was time to store extra water. This was astronomy as applied science, a fusion of myth and mathematics so seamless it challenges our modern divide between superstition and empiricism. What's staggering is how accurate they were. Modern climatologists comparing Mayan records with tree ring data have found their drought predictions aligned almost perfectly with actual dry spells. Their long count calendar, infamous for its supposed doomsday association with 2012, was actually a masterpiece of celestial engineering, able to sync solar years, lunar months, and even the erratic appearances of Venus within a single system. At Chichen Itza, the Pyramid of Kukulkan casts a shadow serpent during equinoxes, a stone-built almanac that told farmers when to plant and when to pray. Yet beneath this precision lay a chilling pragmatism. When the stars foretold drought, kings didn't just perform rituals, they waged wars. Stelae at Tikal described raids on neighboring cities during predicted dry periods, seizing not just territory but resources. The infamous drought cults of the terminal classic period saw mass sacrifices of children and nobles, their bones buried in cenotes as desperate bargaining chips with the gods. Even their famed ball game took on darker tones during lean years, the rubber balls bounce echoing thunder. Its court a symbolic battleground where human effort could still sway divine will. This duality, calculators in one hand, sacrificial knives in the other, captures the Mayan genius. They didn't see a contradiction between tracking planets and bleeding for rain. To them, the universe was a living contract where observation and obligation worked in tandem. Today, as satellites monitor soil moisture and drones assess crop health, we've replaced chalk with data, but the essential question remains the same. How do we prepare for a world that's both predictable and perilous? The Mayans answered with calendars in their observatories and knives in their temples, a reminder that understanding nature has never erased the need to plead with it. The Romans didn't just build aqueducts, they bent geography to their will. Picture a million-gallon river flowing through the heart of Rome, carried on towering stone arches that defied mountains and valleys. This wasn't just plumbing, it was a shield against disaster. When droughts parched the countryside, these engineered waterways kept the city alive, turning arid hills into fertile gardens. But here's what's fascinating: those same arches weren't just functional. They were decorated with carvings of river gods and nymphs, a reminder that even as Romans conquered nature, they still honored its power. The aqueducts weren't merely infrastructure, they were temples to humanity's pact with the elements, where engineering and reverence flowed together like water through lead pipes. Half a world away, China's imperial engineers faced a different kind of threat: the Yangtze's catastrophic floods. Their solution, the Duzhongyan system, built in 256 BCE and still functioning today. Instead of brute force dams, they sculpted the river itself, dividing its flow with artificial islands and spillways that redirected fury into fertility. Local farmers called it the dragon's whiskers, believing the channels followed the paths of ancient water spirits. Modern hydrologists would recognize something startlingly precise: an early example of sediment diversion, using nature's own mechanics to prevent disaster. The genius of Duzhongyan wasn't just in its stones, but in its philosophy: work with the river, not against it. Now consider the Great Wall, often misunderstood as just a military barrier. To the Ming Dynasty builders, its undulating form wasn't just strategic, it was cosmic. They aligned sections with constellations, believing the wall channeled the same energy as the celestial dragon that brought rain. When earthquakes struck, its flexible design mortar mixed with sticky rice allowed it to sway rather than shatter. This blend of symbolism and survival runs through all ancient megaprojects. In Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs built causeways with removable bridges to control floods and invaders alike. In Mauryan India, drought-proof stepwells doubled as sacred gathering places, their geometric depths mirroring the universe's order. What unites these marvels isn't just ingenuity, but a shared recognition that disasters aren't anomalies to fear, but rhythms to anticipate. When Hadrian's engineers included overflow channels in Roman bridges, they weren't just solving for floods, they were encoding generations of flood memory into stone. The lesson echoes down to our era of climate crises. Resilience isn't about conquering nature, but conversing with it. Today's engineers might use satellite models instead of star charts, but the goal remains unchanged: to build a world where safety and meaning share the same foundation. In the mist-shrouded valleys of ancient Japan, rivers didn't just flood, they transformed into monsters. The legend of Yamata no Orochi, the eight-headed serpent that devoured villages, wasn't just a campfire tale. Picture this: every year, as monsoon rains swelled the rivers, entire communities watched helplessly as the waters split into multiple raging currents, 8 to be exact, each branch swallowing homes and fields like the heads of a voracious beast. The hero Susanoo didn't just slay a mythical creature, he tamed a natural disaster, luring the serpent with dams of sake barrels before striking its heart. This wasn't mere fantasy, it was environmental management disguised as epic. Archaeologists have found evidence of early flood control systems near the Izumo region, where the Yamata no Orochi story originates, that mirror Susanoo's tactics. Ancient levees built in zigzag patterns resemble the traps described in the myth, while ceremonial sake offerings to rivers echo the drunken serpent motif. The parallels are too precise to dismiss. What's brilliant about this allegory is how it turns passive fear into active strategy. A farmer hearing the tale didn't just dread floods, he learned to channel them, to divert their fury like Susanoo diverting the serpent's attention. Even the monster's death yields a lesson. From its tail comes the sacred sword Kusanagi, symbolizing how surviving disasters can forge resilience. But the myth's genius lies in its duality. Yamata no Orochi isn't purely a villain, it's also a force of renewal. The serpent demands sacrifices, yes, but its defeat brings fertility to the land, much like how controlled floods replenish soil. Modern hydrologists studying Japan's alluvial plains confirm this ancient intuition. Seasonal flooding, while destructive, carries nutrient-rich sediments crucial for rice cultivation. The story encodes a truth later civilizations would rediscover, that nature's threats and gifts often wear the same skin. This blending of heroism and hydrology appears globally. Compare Susanu to the Mesopotamian god Ninurta, who redirected the Tigris's floods by piling stones atop a demon's corpse, or to China's Yu the Great, who carved channels through mountains to tame the Yellow River. Each culture framed disaster control as divine drama, making survival strategies feel inevitable rather than impossible. When modern engineers in Tokyo build underground floodwater cathedrals, they're still channeling Susanu's spirit, not fighting nature but outthinking it. The serpent's heads still rise, but now we count them in cubic meters per second, and the sake has been replaced by reinforced concrete. Yet the old story lingers, reminding us that every disaster myth is really a blueprint in disguise. To the Zoroastrians of ancient Persia, fire wasn't just a tool, it was the divine made visible. Imagine standing in a fire temple at dusk, watching the eternal flames dance atop a marble altar, their light reflecting off the faces of priests in white robes. This wasn't mere ceremony, it was communion. The sacred fire, or Atta, represented the essence of Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, pure, unyielding, and life-sustaining. Yet outside those temple walls, fire showed another face. When wildfires swept across the dry plains, devouring crops and homes, they weren't seen as contradictions to the sacred flames but as trials. A Zoroastrian farmer watching his fields burn might have whispered prayers not just for deliverance but for understanding. Was this punishment for impurity or a challenge to prove his resilience? This duality shaped every aspect of Persian life. Cities like Persepolis were designed with fire in mind, not just to prevent disaster, but to honor its sacred role. Wide streets acted as fire breaks, while rooftops held vessels of water ready to douse sparks before they reached temple districts. The famed Chahar-Tak fire temples stood isolated on hilltops, their domed chambers housing flames that had burned for generations, far from the threat of accidental blazes. Even the homes of ordinary citizens reflected this balance. Cooking fires were kept small and contained, while communal hearths in town squares became gathering places where stories and embers glowed side by side. But the true innovation lay in how Zoroastrians turned fear into ritual. The annual festival of Sadeh celebrated fire's life-giving power by lighting bonfires atop snowy mountains, a defiance of winter's darkness. Yet the same priests who lit those flames also led processions to combat wildfires, carrying sacred tools to dig fire breaks, not as a rejection of the divine, but as partnership with it. Fire was a test, yes, but also a teacher. A wildfire clearing dead brush was seen as nature's purification, making way for new growth. This philosophy extended to their famed towers of silence, where the dead were exposed to the elements not burned but consumed by vultures under the open sky. Even in death, fire's duality was respected, too sacred for cremation, yet central to the cosmic cycle. What's striking is how these ancient practices echo modern fire ecology. Today's forest managers conduct controlled burns to prevent catastrophic wildfires, mirroring the Zoroastrian belief in fire's dual role as destroyer and renewer. Their temple's isolation resembles our buffer zones around vulnerable ecosystems. The difference, where we see chemistry and risk assessment, they saw divine will and human duty intertwined. When a California firefighter watches a backfire cleanse a hillside, she's channeling the same intuition that guided a Persian priest 2,000 years ago. that sometimes, to master the flame, you must first understand its sacredness. The Nile turning to blood wasn't just a biblical plague, it was an ecological mystery waiting to be decoded. Picture Egyptian farmers knee-deep in crimson water, their sandals stained as if wading through wine, fish floating belly up in a river that had sustained civilizations for millennia. Ancient scribes called it divine wrath, but modern scientists point to Oscillatoria rubescens, a type of algae that blooms explosively in warm, polluted water, suffocating marine life and tinting the surface scarlet. This phenomenon, known today as a red tide, still plagues waterways from Florida to the Baltic. The parallel is uncanny. Both the Book of Exodus and contemporary ecologists describe waters undrinkable, fisheries collapsed, and economies upended. The difference, where Pharaoh's priests saw Yahweh's hand, we see nitrogen runoff and climate shifts, two explanations separated by 3,000 years but united by human awe at nature's upheaval. Frogs erupting from the riverbanks might sound like supernatural horror, but herpetologists recognize a chillingly logical sequence. When algae blooms deplete oxygen, amphibians flee contaminated water en masse, their frantic exodus a desperate bid for survival. Ancient Egyptians, witnessing this sudden invasion of croaking creatures in their homes and beds, interpreted it as cosmic punishment. Yet the plague's self-destructive end, frogs dying in heaps, their bodies festering in the streets, mirrors real-world mass die-offs caused by toxins or disease. Even the subsequent lice and flies fit the pattern. Decomposing amphibians become breeding grounds for parasites, cascading into insect infestations. What makes this more than coincidence is the meticulous cause and effect the narrative preserves, an almost clinical observation of ecological dominoes falling, wrapped in the language of miracles. Then comes the hail, fire mingled with ice, a detail that once seemed purely poetic until volcanologists weighed in. The eruption of Santorini around 1600 BC, one of history's most catastrophic volcanic events, spewed ash across the Mediterranean, potentially altering weather patterns for years. Ice cores from Greenland show traces of this eruption, while Egyptian records mention unseasonal storms. Supercooled raindrops passing through volcanic ash clouds could indeed form bizarre hail, its layers of ice and soot appearing to burn. For Pharaoh's court, such weather wasn't just unusual, it was apocalyptic, a sign the gods had upended the natural order. Today, we'd call it a volcanic winter, same phenomena, different frameworks. Locusts, darkness, livestock plagues, each curse has its mirror in environmental processes. Swarms of Schistosoca gregaria still darken North African skies when rains follow drought, their arrival as predictable to entomologists as it was terrifying to the ancients. The 3 days of darkness aligns with Habub sandstorms or volcanic ash blotting out the sun. Even the final plague, the death of firstborns, finds grim parallels in mycotoxin outbreaks, where mold-contaminated grain stores disproportionately affect the young and malnourished. But here's what's truly profound. The Exodus story doesn't just list disasters, it layers them into a crescendo, showing how environmental collapse compounds. A poisoned river leads to dead frogs, which breed flies, which spread disease, which weakens herds, which invites locusts to finish the crippled harvest. It's a Bronze Age case study in systems failure, dressed in theology. Whether read as scripture or ecological allegory, the plagues reveal humanity's oldest struggle to distinguish divine will from natural cause. The same Nile that brought life could bring ruin, its floods and failures shaping not just harvests but history. When modern scientists debate climate change or pandemic origins, we're still wrestling with that same question. Are disasters random or do they carry meaning? The answer perhaps lies in the telling. For the Israelites, the plagues marked liberation. For the Egyptians, calamity. The river didn't change, only what people saw in its crimson currents. Deucalion's story begins not with divine wrath, but with a warning. Unlike the vengeful floods of Mesopotamia or the Mayan deluges sent to wipe out flawed creations, the Greek version had an almost scientific foreshadowing. Prometheus, the titan who stole fire for humanity, whispered to his son Deucalion that Zeus planned to cleanse the earth not out of anger but as a reset. The instructions were precise: build a wooden chest, stock it with provisions, and wait. When the skies opened, Deucalion and his wife Pirha floated for 9 days until the waters receded, landing on Mount Parnassus to repopulate the world by tossing stones that miraculously became people. There's a striking practicality here: no 40 days of rain, no demands for animal pairs, just a father's whispered tip and a son's pragmatic survival. By the time philosophers like Thales of Miletus began pondering floods in the 6th century BC, the tone had shifted entirely. Thales proposed that earthquakes, often linked to floods in Greek thought, weren't Poseidon's trident strikes but shifts in the earth floating on water, his theory bubbling up from observation, not legend. Anaximander took it further, suggesting floods and droughts cycled naturally as the world dried out or became moist, a primitive hydrologic cycle stripped of divine intervention. Even the playwright Euripides snuck skepticism into his tragedies, having characters question whether floods were really punishments or just the way of things. This pivot from myth to proto-science didn't erase the old stories, it layered them. Greek temples still displayed Deucalion's ark as a relic, but now alongside maps of river deltas and texts debating sedimentary deposits. The flood myth endured, but its purpose evolved, less a divine warning, more a metaphor for nature's rhythms. When Herodotus described the Nile's floods, he didn't invoke gods. He measured silt lines and interviewed Egyptian farmers. The same culture that cherished Deucalion's tale also produced the first known floodplain zoning laws, mandating how far buildings should stand from rivers based on seasonal patterns. What makes this shift so revolutionary isn't just the rejection of supernatural causes, it's the quiet confidence that humans could decipher nature's rules without angering the gods. Deucalion's stones became Thales' water theories, not because one replaced the other, but because both sought answers to the same terrifying question: how do we survive a world that can drown us without warning? The Greeks kept building arks, but now they were also building aqueducts, turning survival stories into infrastructure. Beneath the grid-patterned streets of Mohenjo-Daro, the Indus Valley civilization built what might be history's first municipal disaster plan, not carved in stone tablets, but woven into the very bricks beneath their feet. Their drainage systems weren't mere gutters. They were hydrological masterpieces with covered channels sloping precisely to manage monsoon floods, and terracotta pipes designed to prevent sewage backups during storms. Archaeologists have found houses raised on platforms in flood-prone areas, while granaries stood on elevated mounds, evidence of a society that didn't just endure seasonal disasters, but engineered around them. The genius lay in the details. Even street corners were rounded to divert rushing water, a subtle touch that speaks volumes about foresight. This wasn't just infrastructure, it was collective memory made physical, each brick echoing lessons learned from generations of watching the Indus River's moods. Across the Pacific, the oral traditions of Pacific Northwest tribes held warnings just as precise, though whispered instead of mortared. The story of the thunderbird and the whale, passed down for centuries among the Ho and Quileute peoples, describes a great battle that shook the earth and sent waves taller than cedars crashing inland. Modern geologists have since uncovered evidence of massive Cascadia earthquakes around 1700 CE, with accompanying tsunamis that match the tribal accounts down to the timing. when the sun rose in the wrong place. These weren't just myths, they were survival manuals encoded in allegory. Villages along the coast were strategically placed on bluffs or behind sand dunes, while winter settlements moved inland patterns that align eerily with tsunami inundation maps. A grandmother telling the Thunderbird story by firelight wasn't just entertaining children, she was teaching them real estate strategy. What unites these two approaches, Indus Valley engineering and Native American storytelling, is their shared recognition that disaster isn't an anomaly, but a rhythm. The Indus people didn't just react to floods, they structured their cities to accommodate them, like a dancer anticipating a partner's steps. Similarly, tribal elders didn't see tsunamis as freak events, but as inevitable chapters in a long conversation between land and sea. Both cultures rejected the idea of helplessness, choosing instead to embed resilience into daily life. When archaeologists found Indus Valley wells positioned to avoid saltwater intrusion during storms, or when anthropologists recorded Tlingit tales warning against building where the ocean once slept, they were uncovering the same truth. Ancient wisdom often wears two faces, one practical, one poetic, but both aimed at the same goal: survival. The lesson for our era of climate crises isn't just about technology or tradition, but about how seamlessly the two can intertwine. Modern seismologists now collaborate with native storytellers to cross-check tsunami chronologies, while engineers study Harappan drainage to improve flood control in Mumbai. The past whispers that the best defenses aren't just concrete or satellites, but the stories we tell and the patterns we notice. After all, a child who grows up hearing about the Thunderbird might just grow up to build on higher ground. The sands of Egypt whisper secrets not just of pharaohs and pyramids, but of catastrophes that shook the world. Among the faded hieroglyphs in tombs and temples, scholars have found cryptic references to the sky in turmoil and days when Ra hid his face, descriptions that might seem poetic until you match them with tree ring data from Ireland and ash layers in Greenland. These scattered clues point to one earth-shattering event: the eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE, a blast so powerful it may have echoed in Egyptian records despite being 700 miles away. Imagine priests in Thebes watching the horizon darken not with the usual dust storms, but with a strange, sulfurous haze that blotted out the sun for weeks. Crops failed, temperatures plummeted, and somewhere beyond the known world, an entire island vanished in fire and water. What makes these Egyptian accounts so fascinating isn't just their possible connection to Thera, it's how they reveal the invisible threads tying ancient civilizations together. When pumice from the eruption washed up on Nile Delta shores, it wasn't just volcanic rock. It was physical proof that no kingdom, no matter how mighty, was insulated from nature's whims. The same ash that buried Akrotiri might have chilled Egyptian vineyards, disrupting the wine trade with Crete. The same tsunamis that drowned Minoan ports could have sent freak waves surging up the Nile, leaving fishermen to whisper of Poseidon's wrath in a land that worshipped no such god. This wasn't just a local disaster, it was a global moment, one of the first times humanity faced the reality of a connected planet. Yet the real magic lies in how differently cultures processed the same event. While Minoan artists painted swirling octopuses and dolphins, capturing a world of vibrant motion, Egyptian scribes recorded chaos in stark administrative terms. The harvest is diminished, the granaries stand empty. Where Greeks later spun tales of Atlantis, Egyptians saw bureaucracy straining under the weight of famine. Both responses, though opposite in tone, shared a common impulse to wrest meaning from the inexplicable. Even the biblical plagues of Exodus, often dated to this turbulent period, take on new resonance when read alongside Thera's aftermath. Could the darkness that could be felt have been volcanic ash? The hail mixed with fire, a memory of superheated ejecta raining from the sky. The parallels are too striking to dismiss. Archaeologists have pumice pumice from Thera embedded in Egyptian mortar, repurposed by builders who likely never knew its origin. That small detail captures the era's paradox. Societies were close enough to share disaster's aftermath, yet too distant to recognize their shared vulnerability. Today, as satellites track ash clouds across continents and seismometers ping alerts worldwide, we've lost the luxury of such ignorance. Thera's lesson that catastrophe respects no borders was written in dust and desperation millennia ago. We're still learning to read it. To the Choctaw people, a tornado wasn't just wind, it was the storm serpent, a colossal being twisting through the sky, its tail scraping the earth into spirals of destruction. Unlike European tales that cast storms as divine punishment, this serpent wasn't inherently evil. It was a force of nature, as indifferent as it was terrifying, a reminder that humanity wasn't the center of the world but a small part of its balance. When the serpent passed, tearing trees from the ground like blades of grass, survivors didn't just rebuild, they reflected. The damage wasn't framed as wrath, but as a lesson in humility, a nudge to remember their place in a world far more powerful than human ambitions. Other tribes carried similar stories. The Lakota spoke of the Wakinian, thunder beings whose wings stirred the winds into cyclones, their anger flaring when humans grew arrogant. Yet even in their fury, these beings were respected, not reviled. Rituals arose to honor them, offerings of tobacco laid out before storms, prayers whispered not for deliverance but for understanding. Compare this to the Puritan settlers who saw twisters as God's cleansing fire, a moral reckoning for sinful communities. The difference in perspective couldn't be starker. One culture sought coexistence, the other conquest. What's striking is how these legends doubled as survival guides. The Choctaw noted that the storm serpent often traveled from southwest to northeast, a detail that aligns eerily with modern tornado alley patterns. Stories warned against building permanent structures in low-lying areas where the serpent drinks, echoing today's advice to avoid floodplains. Even the description of the serpent's sound, a roar like 1,000 rattlesnakes, matches survivor accounts of tornadoes' freight train din. These weren't just myths, they were oral maps of danger passed down through generations. The deeper wisdom lies in the humility these tales nurtured. When the Osage spoke of tornadoes as the breath of the earth turning over, they framed destruction as part of renewal, like a forest fire clearing way for new growth. There's a quiet radicalism in that view, an acceptance that nature's violence isn't personal, just inevitable. Today, as climate change amplifies storms, that indigenous perspective feels less like folklore and more like foresight. Maybe the storm serpent wasn't just a warning about the sky, but about the consequences of forgetting our place in the web of life. When disaster struck in ancient Rome, the response wasn't just rebuilding, it was ritual. After earthquakes or plagues, the Senate would summon priests to perform the Procuratio Prodigium, a ceremony to identify and expel whatever or whoever had offended the gods. Sometimes it was a corrupted priest or a neglected temple. Other times the blame fell on outsiders. In 228 BCE, after a series of devastating earthquakes, Rome buried 2 Greek and 2 Gaulish prisoners alive in the Forum Boreum, a brutal offering to appease the underworld gods. This wasn't just superstition, it was social triage, a way to redirect collective panic onto a single, expendable target. The logic was chillingly efficient. If chaos had a human face, then order could be restored by destroying it. Mesopotamia took this further, turning disaster into political theater. When the Euphrates flooded or crops failed, kings like Hammurabi didn't just pray, they performed. Clay tablets describe rulers donning sackcloth, covering themselves in ashes, and publicly confessing sins to the gods. But these spectacles always had a twist. The king's humility inevitably revealed that the true culprits were corrupt officials or disrespectful citizens. A 7th century BC text from Nineveh captures this perfectly. Because the people have sinned, the gods have withheld the rains, but the king, their shepherd, intercedes. The message was clear. Disaster proved the ruler's divine connection even as it punished his subjects' failings. Europe's witch trials took this impulse to its darkest extreme. Between 1484 and 1782, tens of thousands, mostly women, were executed for causing storms, frosts, and plagues. Trial records from Switzerland describe confessions of witches riding the wind to summon hailstorms that crushed vineyards. In Norway, the cold summer of 1615 later, linked to a volcanic eruption in Peru, sparked mass witch burnings, with desperate communities blaming magic for their frozen fields. What's revealing isn't the absurdity of the accusations, but their function. Witch hunts didn't just explain misfortune, they offered the illusion of control. If a storm was caused by a crone's curse, then killing her might prevent the next one. Fast forward to today, and the pattern holds. Only the scapegoats wear modern disguises. After Hurricane Katrina, conspiracy theorists claimed the storm was divine punishment for New Orleans' sinfulness. COVID-19 sparked attacks on Asian communities as politicians called it the China virus. Even climate change gets framed as moral reckoning, with some preachers calling wildfires God's judgment, rather than confronting industrial pollution. The mechanism hasn't changed. We still crave narratives where suffering isn't random, but deserved, where victims had it coming and perpetrators can be named, shamed, or silenced. What's chilling is how this instinct warps our ability to respond to real threats. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, pogroms against Jewish communities distracted from public health measures that might have saved lives. Today, blaming marginalized groups for disasters delays policy changes that could mitigate future crises. The ancient Romans buried outsiders to cleanse their city. We enact travel bans and border walls, mistaking exclusion for safety. Yet there's an alternative buried in history. After the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, Voltaire mocked those who called it divine justice, asking how crushing churches and brothels alike could be moral. His contemporary, Immanuel Kant, published one of the first scientific analyses of quakes, urging societies to study rather than moralize disasters. Their voices were outliers then, but they point to a path we're still struggling to follow, one where chaos doesn't demand a villain and survival depends on empathy, not blame. The ghosts of the accused, from Rome's buried prisoners to Salem's hanged women, whisper the same lesson. When we hunt scapegoats, we're not preventing disaster. We're becoming it. The shift from myths to meteorology didn't happen overnight. It was a slow unraveling of old certainties, one observation at a time. Consider the story of Edmund Halley, the English astronomer who, in 1718, traced the path of a comet and predicted its return with mathematical precision. For centuries, comets had been seen as harbingers of doom, their sudden appearances sparking panic from Babylon to Byzantium. Halley's calculations changed everything. By proving these celestial visitors followed predictable orbits, he stripped them of their supernatural aura, turning omens into equations. Yet even as science demystified the heavens, traces of ancient fear lingered. When Halley's comet reappeared in 1910, newspapers still warned of its malevolent influence, and entrepreneurs sold comet pills to ward off its poisonous vapors. The mind had accepted the truth, but the gut still flinched at the old terror. This tension between old and new played out even more dramatically with earthquakes. In 1755, Lisbon was reduced to rubble by a quake so violent it shook the foundations of European thought. Theologians called it divine punishment for the city's sins, while Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire seized on it as proof of nature's indifference. Meanwhile, a young Immanuel Kant published one of the first scientific treatises on seismology, arguing that quakes were caused by underground fires, a flawed theory, but a radical departure from blaming Poseidon's wrath. Fast forward to modern plate tectonics, and we now map fault lines with satellite precision. Yet even today, the phrase, act of God, remains etched into insurance policies, a linguistic fossil of the belief that disasters carry moral weight. The same duality shapes how we process storms. Ancient Hawaiians saw hurricanes as the goddess Pele battling her sister Namakaeakahi, their clashes churning the ocean into fury. By the 1800s, meteorologists like Father Benito Viñes were tracking storm paths with barometers and telegraph reports, laying the groundwork for modern forecasting. Now we have Doppler radar and hurricane hunters flying into the eye of the storm, yet when a cyclone bears down, you'll still find people boarding up windows with religious icons tucked between the plywood. Science explains the wind, but the soul still seeks a story. Perhaps the most telling example lies in pandemics. The Black Death was once blamed on miasma or Jewish conspiracies. Today, we sequence plague bacteria in labs. COVID-19 spawned its own myths, from 5G towers to divine tests, even as virologists decoded its genome in record time. The pattern is clear. With every leap in understanding, superstition retreats but never fully vanishes. We've traded earthquake dragons for seismic scales, tempest gods for atmospheric models, yet part of us still watches the sky for signs. This isn't a failure of progress, it's a testament to how deeply we crave narrative. Data can predict a quake's magnitude, but it can't answer why a school collapses while a brothel stands. Physics explains lightning, but not why it strikes one farmer's field and spares another's. Ancient cultures wrapped these uncertainties in myth because stories are the original survival tools, not just explaining the world, but making it bearable. When we call a tsunami an act of God, we're not rejecting science, we're acknowledging that some truths are too vast for equations alone. The real evolution isn't from superstition to science, but from fearing the gods to respecting the forces they once symbolized, a journey where the old magic doesn't disappear but changes form. From the thunderbolts of Zeus to the meticulous records of Mayan astronomers, humanity's journey to understand disasters has always been a dance between reverence and reason. Ancient myths weren't just attempts to explain the unexplainable, they were the first steps toward something greater, a language for grappling with chaos. When the Aztecs charted Venus to predict droughts or the Chinese engineered earthquake detectors, they weren't abandoning their gods. They were expanding the conversation, blending prayer with observation, ritual with experimentation. This duality still echoes today. Modern meteorologists name hurricanes not to appease storm gods, but to humanize the impersonal forces we track with satellites. Climate scientists study rising seas with the same urgency that drove Egyptian priests to monitor nilometers, except now, the stakes are global. The tools have changed, but the core challenge remains. How do we coexist with a world that doesn't care about our plans? Ancient cultures answered with sacrifices and star charts. We answer with carbon credits and supercomputers. Yet both responses share a common thread: the refusal to accept helplessness. There's wisdom in these old stories, buried like pumice in Egyptian mortar. The Choctaw storm serpent teaches respect for nature's power without demanding submission. The Greek tale of Deucalion reminds us that survival often depends on preparation, not just providence. Even the darkest myths, like those blaming disasters on human sin, reveal a profound truth. We've always sought meaning in suffering because meaning fuels action. As wildfires rage and glaciers melt, we're writing the next chapter of this ancient story. Will future civilizations look back at our climate models the way we study Mayan eclipse tables? Will they see our struggles as superstition or science? The answer depends on whether we learn the deepest lesson our ancestors left us. That understanding nature requires both humility to accept its power and audacity to decode its secrets. If these echoes across time resonated with you, let's keep the conversation going. Drop a comment below. Which ancient disaster myth stuck with you? Was it the Norse fire giants, the Japanese earthquake catfish, or something else? And if you enjoyed this journey from myth to microscope, don't forget to like and subscribe for more explorations where history and mystery collide. Until next time, stay curious and maybe keep an eye on the sky. You never know when the gods or geology might decide to make their next move.